Hello, welcome to MEMO Conversations. I'm video producer Osman Butt with Middle East Monitor. Today we're going to be discussing a topic which is to do with, since the 7th of October as beginning of the Hamas offensive into Israel and then Israel's violent military response to Gaza, which has seen many people being killed in Gaza by Israeli forces. Of course, this issue didn't start on the 7th of October. But for many people, especially those outside of the Middle East who are Arab, Palestinian, Muslim, and various other identities, many have felt like they've been placed under, their identities are being attacked, they're made to feel unwelcome. There's a suspicion that if you stand with Palestine, you are suspect for many people. And so this is going to be the discussion we're having today, as well as discussing things around therapy and other related topics. My guest today is Layla Maghribi. Layla is a British Arab journalist currently based in the UK after several years in the Middle East working for international media outlets, including Reuters and CNN International. Raised in England, Layla has lived in Italy, Syria, Lebanon, and the UAE, and has a special interest in social issues affecting Arabic-speaking communities, particularly in relation to culture, immigration, and mental health. She's currently the host of the third Culture Therapy, a podcast that explores mental well-being from a cultural perspective, and is writing her first non-fiction book. And I do strongly advise our audience to go out and check that podcast. Layla, welcome to MEMO Conversations.
Thank you, Osman. It's very happy to be speaking with you today.
And it's our pleasure to have you. You recently released a sort of, it's an article, but you also did an audio recording of it too, which is to do with, which was entitled, "As a British Arab, Am I Safe in the UK Now?" And could you perhaps tell us, why did you feel the need to write this article?
Yes, of course. I felt the need to write this because of a very strong and intense fear that I felt very early on after the Hamas attacks and the Israeli response and retaliation in Gaza. I felt a fear not only for what was to come, what was to befall Gaza and its inhabitants, but for the first time, I actually felt a fear for myself, which is odd when you think that I live in London and I'm very far away from the conflict and the violence and fighting. But the reason I felt that was because very early on, the rhetoric and the dialogue that was being used by the Israelis and the Israeli defense forces was quite clearly stating that their offensive was going to be very extreme and with no holds barred and no red lines. And what was scary to me was that my government here in the UK effectively gave them a round of applause and said, "Go ahead," and was very vocal in giving unequivocal support to Israel without any stipulations or conditions. And I felt quite terrified by that, because I felt that that was essentially saying that people like me were not worthy of protection and were not worthy of humanitarian consideration. And it only got worse as the dialogue and the rhetoric from our Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, was also intensified, such that it became potentially, or it was proposed to make even, the act of showing support for Palestinians had the potentiality to be criminalized, or at least it was threatened with that. Right, whether it was in condemning the marches of solidarity and the like. And all of that made me feel very strongly that there was a significant shift that had taken place, and that actually, even though I was far away from the bombs and the missiles, that I wasn't actually feeling as safe as I had historically.
Yes, it's been quite an alarming month, in fact, because obviously we've got this horrendous, war being inflicted upon the people of Gaza, and we keep seeing every day this loads of people being killed. Then you get those horrific moments where internet gets cut out from Gaza, and then you don't know what's happening. And even at Middle East Monitor, we have people who are in Gaza, and we have people who are from Gaza living in London. It's been kind of a horrendous experience. And obviously, even for people who don't have family in Gaza, just the entire atmosphere of the country feels different at this moment in time. I mean, and to hear, for example, to give audience some context, the Conservative government, not just the Home Secretary, has routinely labelled the solidarity with Palestine marches as hate marches. And so I want to sort of get a sense of how, you've said you feel terrified, but I wonder if you could go a bit further into that and tell us, how does it feel to be described as a hateful person by the government?
It feels, very horrible. It's such a basic word, but it just feels, very, it feels like a very personal attack. It feels disenfranchising. It feels like a rejection. It feels like a dehumanization. It feels like a demonization. It feels very much like I am, and people like me are being targeted for showing care and concern for civilians' lives. And that is, intellectually very difficult to understand, let alone emotionally. The world over, everyone, not just Arabs or Muslims, but everyone in the world has been raised in this century with the notion that there are international human rights, that there are conventions to protect civilians, that we have rules of war, and that we should always be trying to advocate for peace and for protection of civilians. So then when that is precisely what we are going out asking for, and that is being turned into something hateful, there's a very severe cognitive dissonance happening, as well as an emotional reaction, which is like, wow, me, you're calling me hateful, but like what I'm asking for is something that I thought we were all on board here. I thought this was a good thing. I don't think ever in my life I've witnessed a ceasefire be so vilified as a word. Like that's become the insult or the dirty word, as opposed to war. And that is, it's a hard thing to manage intellectually, and emotionally it does make you feel isolated and afraid. Yes, on the one hand, we have such a huge community, and I believe in the public support that exists, but we are also cognizant of the fact that there are powers that do control, to a certain extent, our freedom and our ability to activate. And it starts to become worrying when we see that shift into potentially shutting that down. And I think that's where the fear lies.
But also, I mean, aside from the fear you have of government labeling you hateful, it's also the fact that, and I think this is not appreciated enough, like everyone, you're going through your social media and you're just seeing these images coming out of Palestine of, Palestinians losing their lives, injuries, all sorts of terrible things. So to describe to us, what is the experience like for someone like you who has to scroll through and see all of that?
Oh, it's absolutely horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous. And I think now that we've entered the second month, you will be seeing and hearing of a lot more sort of mental and emotional breakdowns, because, humans are not meant to consume that much violent destruction under any circumstances. What we're witnessing is really unfathomable, but it's also like unprecedented in this extremity, I mean, I know we had something similar with the Syrian civil war, in terms of this steady stream of, like this televised war unfolding, but it was, but the intensity with which you're seeing Gaza being bombarded, and the death toll and the number of children in particular. And we're effectively seeing like massacres committed in real time. It's like a live streaming of horrific violence and horrific death toll. So it is very, very difficult, and also not to be taken lightly. Like, this isn't something we're meant to be consuming and be okay with, like, absolutely not. And I think in the early days, I, like many others, I just felt so activated by this need to do something to try and stop, what was occurring. So we, like many, just on social media, trying to share, trying to tweet, trying to connect and just amplify our voices. And as a result, we're also witnessing all of this. But eventually, I must admit that it got to me. By week 3, I was running a lot on this adrenaline and this sort of angry fuel. But I had a real emotional crash, and I couldn't actually, for a few days. I was just in sort of continuous tears. I couldn't really function. I was a bit of a zombie. I had to it was very difficult to do even the tiniest things. I was lucky that my mom was around to sort of help me with that. But I know I'm conscious of the fact that not everybody has a support system, particularly those whose families are abroad and they're living here and they're having to just witness what is happening and not be, where do they get that comfort and support from? So I had to take a few days and a few, days offline actually to recover. And I did, thankfully. I'm glad that I listened to what my body was saying and what my mind needed that time. And now I'm coming back to some sort of balance. But the truth is that what we're experiencing here is a form of secondary trauma. It's a vicarious trauma when you witness so much carnage and bloodshed, and you have this this intense empathy with it. It is a form of trauma. And for others, there is also ancestral trauma that is being activated. People who are descendants of the Nakba of 1948, like I am, and like many other Palestinians abroad are, well, all Palestinians really. And so you witness this unfold, and then you are reminded on a visceral level of what exists in your ancestry, in your heritage. And that's also very very traumatic to experience.
Yes, it's been, I mean, as you say, there's this obviously visceral feeling, but there's also this feeling that others do not get what's going on around you. And when they talk about, all of this, this is hateful, anti-Semitism, Palestinians, who are they? Why are they doing these terrible things? There's just no regard or attempt to understand what many feel. And, sometimes you have a conversation with someone, and for example, one of my boss, she's from Gaza, and you sort of want to say, somebody who obviously doesn't have family in Gaza, you want to say, is there anything I can do for you to help ease this time? Because, like everyone, she's suffering a lot because her family are there. And all she said to me at the time was, can you get my family internet? Just something very simple. And so obviously, and can you prevent the electricity from going out? Obviously I can't. And so it does raise the question for many of us is, well, what is it we can actually do for people in these situations?
There's actually a lot more than we can do than we think we can. And I think it's actually an important aspect of managing the difficult mental and emotional toll, is finding an outlet and a way in which you can be helpful, because otherwise the alternative, in all honesty, is to either completely disconnect from it, which for many of us it's not really possible, or to become desperate and despairing, and that's no good also to anyone. Least of all you also have a life and deserve to have one, and not to be crushed by this despair that is understandable, but we almost have to try as part of resistance to resist that. And, I think every group of people where they are have a different role to play. Arabs and Palestinian allies in the diaspora have their own local initiatives. And I would always encourage anyone to try and connect with people in their community to find out what it is that they can do. But we also have to recognize, like, our governments are complicit in this war on Gaza, in the occupation. And therefore, our role is, of course, to make sure that we are working within our system here to try and stop that in some way or other. And whether that is, lobbying or contacting MPs and making your voice heard, attending marches, for example, to show solidarity, but also it's a very helpful way to connect with other allies and to know what sort of organizations are out there doing work to help, whether it is the Palestinian Solidarity Campaign or whether it is Palestine Action. I mean, there's a really broad spectrum of groups that do work in one way or another to try and further the Palestinian cause. And also there's something to be said on a micro level. People who feel like they want to help but don't know much, I'd encourage them to read, to connect with Palestinians, to follow their accounts, to educate themselves before or during their own activism. The other way to do it is also to be a supportive ally to people who you do know and who are struggling. You mentioned your boss, things like actually checking in with people who do have family there and asking or taking some load off them. Just kindness and understanding goes a huge way. And then, of course, I always say to whoever is online and uses social media or has some sort of platform, to use it, because it is about amplifying the voices and it is about connecting with people, because solidarity is what will ultimately move this forward. And you will know, I'm sure, week on week, these protests, these marches have grown bigger and bigger and more inclusive and spread across the world. And this is very, very important, not only for people in Palestine to see that they do have this support, and despite the bombs raining down on them, that will give a certain degree of comfort, but also for us to recognize that actually there is a shift, and it's an important one for us to keep applying pressure to.
What kind of conversations, based on what you're hearing, have been happening in other, let's say, Palestinian or Arab households? Because as we were mentioning, you have a lot of this hateful rhetoric directed against Palestinians. Also, there's the fear that, we keep hearing the police might intervene if you've got a Palestinian flag. We're hearing all sorts of things. What kind of conversations are your friends and other people having with, themselves, with their families, with their children around safety at this time?
Yeah, a lot of different ones. There are those who have made the decision, maybe somewhat like me, that I am in a certain privileged position, being British and a journalist and a writer, to use my voice and to, just amplify as much as I can the cause. But then there are those who legitimately are concerned about their visa status, because they're on work visas and they're not sure, given the news that we've heard about people being fired or reprimanded for posting anything pro-Palestinian. There have been people who have been threatened for having the flag on their, in their house or outside their building. There have been those who have also even been visited by the police for some posts that they put. I mean, even the Dr. Hassan Abu Sitta, who's been in Gaza since the beginning of these events and who is doing miraculous work under just ridiculous conditions of just constant bombardment. Even his family were visited by the police, not as you would expect to perhaps provide them with some comfort, but instead to, you know, ask them questions that were ultimately they deemed a form of harassment. So there's definitely concern, and these conversations are happening. People are asking questions like, can I do this? Should I do that? What's legal? What isn't? And this is also why all the more reason for people to connect with one another, because I can understand this, you know, climate of fear that has been created. But the reality is, none of anything that we are doing is wrong or illegal. It's not illegal to protest. It's not illegal to march. The Palestinian flag is not illegal. The Palestinian flag is not the Hamas flag. I feel like people need to also remember there is actually a Hamas flag. So if you want to criticize a flag, go ahead, criticize that. But the Palestinian flag is a legitimate flag. You know, I think there's been a lot of dog whistling and threatening words, and understandably people have been afraid by that, but we also have to push back against that sort of threat and say, camaraderie and group work and community is really important for that.
Because you've obviously been somebody who's worked as a journalist, you've covered many war zones. I presume you'll remember post 9/11 as well. I'm sort of wondering though, this time really does feel different to other times. This is kind of hard to answer in a way because I can't quite put my foot on it, my finger, sorry, on it. But you can put your foot on it if you want. But there's this feeling, maybe just viscerally, that it just feels so different this time. Not just the event itself, which is obviously very bad, but the extreme reaction to it. I mean, of course, you know, British government and American governments have always supported Israeli actions. You remember 2014. But I don't recall anywhere near this level of visceral and emotional support outburst from these governments and the media class around them. What is different about this time? Why does this feel different?
It feels different because the masks that have fallen and the reaction has been so flagrantly anti-humanitarian and anti-Palestinian that you can't help but see very clearly that those lives are disregarded and seen as less than. And underpinning that is a colonial racist mindset. And I think this is why it feels different, because it's been uncovered. It's very quite out in the open. It also feels different because it feels like we are really sort of in the midst of like this acute shift towards a repressive, authoritarian, slightly fascist system of governance across Europe and North America, which is also very difficult to comprehend because these countries are always held up as models of democracy and liberalism. But in fact, if you can't even go out and publicly support not killing Palestinian children, then you do begin to wonder what exactly is going on. You know, in Germany and in France, the degree of repression is quite unfathomable. And here in the UK, we're not at that level, thankfully. But you know, the rhetoric calling them hate marches and intimidating people to this degree for their support of Palestine is very repressive. And it is, you know, it's very reminiscent of fascist policies. And so for that reason, it feels very acute and dangerous. On the other hand, the reason why I think it also feels very different is because the groundswell of public support has been very big and very intense. The activation across the world of public consciousness and this mobilization to do something is like never seen before. And so you have these two extreme sort of intense polarities. And I think the gap between the public and the powers on top has never felt wider than it does right now. And so for that reason, I do think we are all sensing that this is different and that this is quite pivotal and intense. Yeah.
Do you think also because, as you mentioned, there's now a much more overtly oppressive environment, a lot of people in these countries across Europe and the West and other countries are picking up on that and saying, well, hang on a minute, there's this obviously horrible war happening elsewhere. Okay, but now you yourself are not only throwing your weight in, you're actively telling people in our country they can't say these things.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that has contributed to having such a groundswell of support, or maybe clarifying it for a lot of people?
It's a good question. It could do. I do think, look, I think at a certain point, there was just such a cognitive dissonance between what people were seeing on their screens via social media and from people on the ground in Gaza versus what they were hearing their politicians say and what they were hearing certain news anchors and journalists say, that they were just themselves feeling like something is not adding up here. And, you know, people aren't stupid. You know, they can see for themselves. They may have a period of time in which they have a lot of question marks, and understandably so. But, you know, the truth is out there. And I think that's, you know, ultimately one of the most significant things about the Palestinian cause. The truth is out there. There's nothing needs to be fabricated. It's all there in black and white. What needs to change is the perspective and the narrative around it. And this is now being done from a bottom up as opposed to a top down, because the top down narrative is completely inconsistent with the bottom up one. And so it remains to be seen how much that's going to factor into changing media coverage. There have been some shifts already, and that's also down to activist work in calling out journalists, in calling out poor journalism, in calling out inaccuracies and biases and inflammatory language. And that's also part of the work that is necessary to be done.
Yeah, on some level, it does feel like the last 12 years sped up into 1 month if you've been covering the Arab world, because we've seen all of these issues play out long term. Now it's just intensified into one period, the month that we've just come out of and going into a new month of it. But it also, you know, as we know, this has been in terms of what's happened in Gaza, it's the biggest, you know, largest number of people have been killed, which we've not seen even in the 2014 war, which was quite brutal by previous standards. We've passed that within the first few weeks. So there's all of that as well. And there's no sign it's going to end anytime soon. I mean, you will see, for example, sometimes in the press, them talking about, well, in the State Department, there's a lot of disquiet about how much support they've given to Israel, fears that this is going to lead to a backlash, also concerns that Israel is breaking international humanitarian law. So even within, you know, the governments themselves, there's a lot of disquiet over why are we backing this? Is there even an end strategy to all of this? There doesn't seem to be. And then you've got Netanyahu going on TV and saying this is going to be like Amalek, you know, remember what they did. It's so much, and it's kind of a peculiar thing to observe, because you feel that if a Palestinian says something which is interpreted as being anti-Semitic or genocidal, let's say a clip from Gaza or somewhere, it immediately gets blown up in the media. But the fact that Israeli politicians have been doing the exact same thing and it doesn't seem to feature at all in the political discourse reveals how bad that bias has been. And I think from the very beginning, you saw that bias, because the first question anyone who was from Gaza got asked was, what do you think of Hamas?
Yes, the but Hamas question.
Right, and no Israeli was asked, well, what do you think of Netanyahu?
I know.
So it's just the appalling, obviously bias, and I honestly don't know what media outlets. I mean, I feel that on some level, at some point, they're going to have to turn around and say, what did we actually do here?
Oh, yes. I mean, I definitely think in the future, when exactly, but there's going to be a reckoning for many people, I think personally, where they ask themselves, how could they actually have allowed themselves to be on board what has happened, not only now, but over the last 75 years in Palestine, but especially now, because there can be no justification for the deaths of 5,000 children and counting. It just isn't. And that was something that all of us around the world were in agreement on. So the fact that they, in any shape or form, have gone back on that is much more a reflection on them than it is on anyone else calling for a ceasefire.
Yes. To change pace a little bit, but not entirely, there is a connecting theme, because obviously I had to talk to you about this because this is something you do. You have a podcast where you talk a lot about therapy, but specifically how, you know, therapy impacts people from certain cultural backgrounds, particularly non-Western or non-weird, as they're called in some literature. We can get into what that is. But I want to sort of start, you know, by asking, what drives your interest in therapy and culture?
Yes, so you're right. My podcast, Third Culture Therapy, does look at not just exclusively therapy, but it generally looks at mental health and mental and emotional health for people who, you know, I loosely say are from non-dominant cultures, so non-Western cultures, and looks at the ways in which different cultures look at it, are impacted by it, treat it, which may or may not include therapy. My own personal interest in this, it came out from my own personal troubles, difficulties with mental health over the years. And a few years ago, I actually reached a sort of point where I was suffering from quite acute anxiety and burnout, a sort of case of burnout, and kind of depression, burnout. It wasn't like an official diagnosis, but, you know, I had quite severe physiological as well as mental difficulties at the time. And I did eventually, you know, find the right sort of treatment and help, which did include therapy, among other things. And when I got better, and in the course of me understanding a bit more what was going on inside me, I also understood how much, you know, how many micro traumas I had endured over the years, as a result of being Arab and from mixed Middle Eastern countries, the Arab Spring, in which, you know, Syria completely collapsed as a result, like, or went through this horrific civil war, and that's where my mother is from. And I was very close to that country and my family there, being a journalist and, you know, working very hard and traveling a lot, and not necessarily being very considered by my bosses at times when they should have been, and other issues, just also thinking about some generational trauma. You know, my father was, you know, a refugee a couple of times over. And so these things, you know, they have an impact, of course. Well, I say of course, but I think sometimes the unfortunate regularity with which people in our part of the world suffer injustices and violences and conflicts means we've developed a certain resilience for it, but actually that can harm us in some ways because we're not really fully processing the things that we are going through. In any event, once I did get better and I had a greater understanding of it, I really felt that I wanted to be able to create some sort of a platform and a voice for people who were not necessarily seeing or hearing themselves in the conversations around mental health that were happening. Because different cultures have their unique set of issues and ways of dealing with it. And the Western model, the Western therapeutic model, is not always the most ideal one for them. And mental health troubles are incredibly isolating because there's a lot of stigma and shame around it. And I really felt like if I could use my experience in any way for positive impact for others that I wanted to. And so I created the podcast, and in it I interview people from different backgrounds, not just Arab and Middle Eastern, but they do feature quite a lot about really different topics, but all related to mental and emotional well-being.
And what has doing this taught you about the approach to mental health many people have taken on from these backgrounds?
Well, interestingly, I've noticed in the last year or so, obviously because of what I do, but also in my interest, but just in conversations with people, a lot of people my generation and below are much more attuned to mental health, their mental health now. Many more are seeking therapy or some form of therapy to help them navigate certain issues or a general feeling or state of mind that they're in. And so there's been a lot more openness than I've ever witnessed before, which is incredibly positive. I think there's also been an understanding among friends of mine who are Middle Eastern that actually there is relevance in finding someone to speak to who is culturally sensitive or culturally aware. Doesn't necessarily have to be even from your exact culture, but someone who does have some understanding and awareness of that. I've definitely heard that be the case, which is all very, very good. You know, anything that is furthering that understanding and that openness is only going to yield more beneficial results.
Yeah, it's an interesting development because it seems to be following the trend of the wider society. If you live in, say, the UK, where there is much more interest in therapy, and obviously going to a therapist is a positive step for many people. It's certainly better than when people self-diagnose based on social media posts, which is a whole thing in of itself. I mean, I have a friend who works as a therapist, and I said to him, "What's one of the biggest issues you have to deal with?" And he says, "People self-diagnosing from social media. If you don't have the training, please don't diagnose yourself." Yeah. And so, because you come in thinking you have a condition that you don't actually have, and mental health is a very interesting area because one of the issues with just on the self-diagnosis point is as soon as you have a label for something, you start thinking that's what you might have. You end up acting out some of the symptoms that you that you think are ascribed to that thing, even though this is not. And this is why you need an actual therapist to go through things with you.
It's a good point. I mean, I when I said to you earlier, I had, I suffered anxiety and burnout and depression. I didn't actually, I say these, and the anxiety part I'm almost, certain of because physically I felt it. But the other two, I never went to get a label. I didn't really necessarily arrive with a label, nor do I really feel like I need it. I just went to see someone because I knew that I needed help at the time. It didn't really matter so much to me what I was calling it or what, and neither did it for him. And I think that was really helpful because we could just look at what was my particular case and situation without the need for fitting it into a particular box. But I can also understand the desire for some people to have a label because it does maybe give them a sense of control and a sense of understanding, and they can pin something on it. I think we have to be just a little bit flexible and fluid with all of that. Maybe sometimes it's helpful because it gives you a signpost, but I also don't think we need to become too attached to it. The underlying issues are there regardless of whether we put an umbrella term on it or not.
Yeah, it's a very important area. It's something to really think about, and I think people who are sort of professionally trained and who are attuned to their patients will, I think, naturally pick that up, because as much as it's important to have vigorous training in this field, just having basic human intuition also, I think, helps guide.
True.
Yeah. But do you, because I think we sort of hinted at it already, but I sort of want to go into it a bit further. What do you think of contemporary therapeutic culture, including therapists, but not just them? And what do you think it sort of misses or gets wrong about the human psyche when it comes to dealing with non-Western peoples?
Yes, I think one of the key things that I think Western therapeutic models do not recognize enough is the importance and the presence of community in Eastern cultures and Mediterranean, Middle Eastern cultures, and how interconnected and how significant our community, and within our community, that also means family within it. And that if anyone is seeking help for their mental health, of course, family and community, family plays a large part, but that is not something that people within our culture would take lightly at all in trying to dismantle and create barriers with. And that could create actually quite a big resistance to therapy at large. Of course, I'm not saying that all Western therapists are there encouraging you to break ties with your family or your parents or this or that. And that is a bit of a stereotyping generalization, and I appreciate that. But I do think that there is definitely, I think, the appreciation of the extent to which family and community are part and parcel of the individual experience. I think that can be underestimated, and it's very and it can be a little bit off-putting sometimes, perhaps, for someone who's already afraid of the whole therapy process. So that's one. And then another is general understanding of, maybe our environment, political, social, historical factors that are also inextricably linked to who we are. You can't really be from that region and not be caught up in what is happening politically, and that does seep into our way of being. I mean, it's even relevant to the fact that why are we here? Why am I in England? Well, because there's a whole history of displacement and conflict that precedes that I arrive here with. And so I think that awareness is necessary to be able to understand, someone's coming in with anxiety, just, it's so multi-layered. When the anxiety, it's a real fear. It's not just I'm anxious because maybe something bad will happen. Like, something bad is happening. And what do I do with that? How do I manage that? So there are these elements that come into play that I think just greater sensitivity and awareness would go a long way. But I also think there are increasingly more and more therapists from third culture backgrounds and Arab backgrounds and Mediterranean backgrounds that are available. And I think it's great that they are, and that people are finding those avenues and those practitioners to go to.
Yeah, I was going to say, with the whole cutting family thing, Freud certainly didn't help there.
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult. Yes, that is a bit hard. Try telling that to an Arab parent. They'll be like, "Excuse me, I have a word. Let me contact your therapist right now."
It's kind of interesting. I think part of the issue has always been, though, I mean, therapists are, people like anyone else, and they're trying to do the best job they can do, most of them, based on what, knowledge basis they have. But they are also dependent upon research as much as anyone else from the field of psychology. And it was an issue, and this is to the credit of psychology as a field. They do recognize they have a problem, or they had a problem where they realize most of their models are based on white men, and they have actually taken steps to address those problems. So now it's a lot more common for them to do not just multicultural, but across global surveys for mental health on stuff to do with psychology, so their models can get better. One of my friends, actually, she is from an Arab country. She lived in an Arab country at the time, and she was recruited onto a program to do surveys on moral psychology. And it was a big global study, and she did it for the Arab world. And it was a really interesting study, she told me, because she said to me, what's interesting is when you would ask, let's say, American college students about certain moral issues, whether it's about relationships, sexuality, general behavior, whatever it is, they would more or less give you similar answers no matter how you change the question. So in psychology, you have something called priming. And priming is basically where, it could mean a number of different things, but essentially it's where you change some of the dynamics, either in the room or in the question, to see if you get different answers. And they found white American men were fairly consistent no matter what you invoked. But when they would ask an Arab, and they did this along a lot of different Arab students, they'd find when certain primes were used, Arabs could be very individualistic and very similar to their white counterparts. But when the priming was changed and other things were mentioned, such as family or God, they would then give you the complete opposite answer of what they just told you.
Yes. Yeah, that makes, wow, that's fascinating. I'd love to read that. And that ties that in, actually. Sometimes I do hear, particularly with older generation, certain things that then when you press them, it changes when you zero in on the more individualistic response versus what they've sort of looked at in the collective. Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, so it's and I think that's something as small as that, which is obviously studies to do with morality, but I think that would have potential practical benefits in therapy if you understand this person has multiple layers to them. And she said to me, this is why Arabs are more fascinating to study.
We're definitely very complex, 100%. And so by extension, perhaps fascinating, also tiring. But yes, it's multi-layered, and it is multi-layered. And often we haven't had a chance to deal with one layer before another layer gets put on top. So there is a lot of work to be done around that. And I also think you cannot take apart what is happening on a societal level from what is happening on an individual one. We are part of a society. We are part of a community. And so there's always going to be that connect and that trickle down, and kind of I think psychology does have to shift to recognize more of that, and maybe work with it.
Well, speaking of family, you're currently writing a non-fiction book which is about your family, and I had a few questions about that, actually, but we'll start with what is this book?
Okay, this book is it's a part memoir, part biography about the history of my family over the last 100 years. It's tracing their continuous displacement over the course of the 20th century. And the biography element it centers around my late father, who was a Palestinian Libyan revolutionary activist in the 1960s, and then also the first prime minister of Libya in 1969 under following the Gaddafi-led coup. He later was ambassador to the UK, and then after some short time, became an oppositionist to Gaddafi and was a dissident in exile in London, which is where I was born and raised. And so this book does look at his quite fascinating life and political relevance and historically, but also it's tracing the impact of these multiple displacements over time and this quite intense politicization that existed in my family, and resistance that was always sort of there in the background on future generations, namely myself as a British-born Arab with that sort of background and history. And it kind of weaves in this political historical with also the personal reflections on what that does to, well, what that has done to my sense of identity and belonging.
Yes, it's an interesting one, because I think you sort of said your grandfather was from Libya, from your father's side.
Yes.
And he was part of the rebellion, I believe, in Libya.
He was part of the anti-Italian colonial resistance. So yes. Libya was colonized by Italy in 1912, and for just up until the end of the Second World War. And yes, he was part of the resistance movement against Italians, and then had to leave because it was very violent, and he had to flee execution and ended up in Haifa in Palestine.
Yes, and your father was born in Haifa.
And my father was born in Haifa in 1933, and was there until 1948 when he was expelled as a teenager. He would have been around 14 years old when the Zionist militia forces came and Israel was created.
Yeah, so this is my question as well. I mean, your father was born in 1933.
Mm-hmm.
You don't look that old to me.
He was a little bit older when he got going with his family and kids. I mean, bless him, he went to prison for a few years, and he was a politician, and there was revolutions, and there was assassination attempts, and poor man didn't really get a chance to have his own life until midlife. Yeah, I'm the youngest of three, and he had me a bit later on, and the lighting is good, so maybe that's why.
No,
It's a combination of these factors.
I don't think you look older than your 30s. This is how you look to me. So this is why I'm like 33.
Yeah, I know.
How?
When I say that, they're like, wait a minute, do you mean you're? I'm like, nope, that's my dad. Yeah. Yeah, so yes.
I was going
to
say it's one of those like what they call, I can't remember what the term is, but it's like historical mind benders. Like you learn about something. This is one of those moments for me.
I know. I know. Yeah, my dad didn't get married until he was over 40 and had his children then. And yeah, so.
Well, so what do you hope to sort of get from doing this book, you know?
Yeah, gosh, there's a lot actually, and it's sort of shifted over the years that I've been working on it. I think for me, it's an important, very personal. Obviously, it's a memoir, it's biography. It's my father, of course, it's very personal. There is this journey of really understanding what my history and heritage has been about. But a lot of it is about looking at a lot of the injuries that have been committed, and a lot of the wounds inflicted by Western colonialism over the years, and how that has reverberated. And while on the one hand, yes, I recognize my luck and privilege of being born and raised in a country like England, the other consequences consequence of that is a rupture from my my people and lands that existed, for centuries beforehand. And that has come with challenges and with a sense of loneliness at times, and questioning belonging and identity and all of these important things that everyone goes through, I suppose, at some point in their life. But there's just so much more complexity when you are from that part of the world. The other element is that I do think it's very important for us to understand our history. And I don't think, unfortunately, we have had the opportunity to, especially in the Western world, in the English language, to present that or to experience it and to relay it. And so I do think at a time of such tumultuousness, it's important for us to also be able to look back and recognize what our ancestors went through and what they did do and what they did achieve and what they fought for, and some of the important gains that they did make. I think we do need more and more now than ever some models of inspiration, and we're lacking quite a bit of leadership. And I know, obviously, I am a little bit biased because he was my dad, but he was a very significant and important revolutionary figure of his era, and I would like people to know that these people existed, and it wasn't just him, but there were many others like him, and unfortunately many of them ended up murdered or in prison. But it's not that they weren't there. And I think it's important for me, as a sense of also our pride, to reclaim some of that. So these are the main reasons why I'm writing this and what I hope to achieve out of it.
It's a last question. So in writing this over the years that you've been doing it, in what way has it sort of changed, challenged, or evolved either your identity and you on a personal level?
Massively. When I first started, it was all about, I had it in mind that I was just writing a biography. I just wanted to write this book about my dad and his history and these important events that happened. And then more and more as I was writing, and with thanks to some really helpful feedback from people that I was showing certain bits and pieces to along the way, I was increasingly invited to include myself in the story and to actually tell my story alongside that important story, and to say, to express what it felt like and what it meant to grow up as a child of Arab diaspora in a highly politicized family. And so that definitely shifted already the style, but also the content, because much as it is about the history, it's also the further back history. It's also now about, what does this mean to grow up, and it's not just me, right? We're like hundreds of thousands of just Arabs alone in the UK, and my story can be reflected into other diaspora, Pakistani, Indian, and the like. It's just that mine is a particular story. And what does it mean to grow up with this sort of hybrid, cross-cultural, dual existence, sometimes conflicting identities? How do we navigate that? What do we do with it? What does it mean to me? And what do I call myself? I used to hate the question, where are you from, with so much, because I always felt like I just wanted to have like a simple one-word answer, and now I have to go Syria, Libya, Palestine, London, and people were just like, what? And I think what's changed for me in writing this book is gaining more confidence in myself and in who I am, and in recognizing that it's absolutely okay to be from multiple places and to occupy multiple spaces. Alongside the writing, there's also, I think that's been part of my therapeutic process, is integration of these different parts of me, and actually recognizing that as a whole, I am complete and my story is also valuable. And I think that's brought me more peace and acceptance of who I am and where my place is in the world.
Layla Maghribi, thank you for talking to us at MEMO Conversations.
You're most welcome. Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
For our audience, thank you for tuning in. If you'd like to catch this or any other episode of MEMO Conversations, you can go to our website, but please do tune in next time for more MEMO Conversations.